that decided to promote a business culture of caring more about profits and convenience than following the law. Now, this can happen across industries and sectors, but here, in promoting this culture of caring more about the profits than compliance, it had devastating consequences, resulting in the inhumane treatment of animals and the pollution and contamination of our waterways here in Virginia. With the guilty pleas announced today in this corporate criminal enforcement action, Envigo RMS and Envigo Global Services, as well as its parent company, Inotiv, are paying over $35 million in fines and additional payments, to include the largest fine ever in an Animal Welfare Act case in history. I want to take a step back, though, and provide a little bit more background about what leads us here today. Envigo, which is a subsidiary of Inotiv, is in the pharmaceutical and biotech industry, as I mentioned, and they have about 20 locations across North America and Europe, to include one facility that was here in the Western District of Virginia, which I'll refer to as the Cumberland facility, located in Cumberland County, Virginia. Our federal and criminal investigation into Envigo became known to the public in May of 2022 when we publicly executed a federal search warrant at that facility. I recognize that no one has heard about our investigation about this case since the events of May of 2022. 4,000 dogs were seized and surrendered after this search warrant, and ever since we've been intentionally quiet while we've been doing our work. We've received our fair share of inquiries about the case, and I'd like to answer as many questions as I can about those here today. Now, Envigo's role as a subsidiary to Inotiv was to breed, export, and sell research quality animals for medical and scientific research purposes. To do this, you have to have proper licenses and permits as given by the Secretary of Agriculture, but also, if you're going to do this, you have to care for animals in compliance with the minimum standards that are set by the Animal Welfare Act, as well as the regulations that accompany it. What this means is that you have to provide humane handling, care, treatment, which means adequate veterinary attention, adequate staffing, adequate spacing, as well as safe and sanitary conditions for these animals. Now, the Cumberland facility, they have multiple facilities here in the United States, but the Cumberland facility specifically was the one where this investigation was launched. It is located in Cumberland County, and it was an expansive, multi-building facility that could house upwards of 5,000 dogs at any given time. And most of the time in its history housed somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 beagles. One of those buildings is depicted here, almost like an army barracks, where it's a long building with individual kennels where groups of dogs were housed in each one of those. And from 2019, leading up to our search warrant in May of 2022, just to give you a sense, at the Cumberland facility alone, Envigo sold just shy of about 15,000 beagles, generating $16 million in revenue, give or take. On May 18th of 2022, we began the execution of a multi-day federal search warrant that took place and took several days to effectuate. And it could not have occurred without the tireless work and effort of federal and state law enforcement investigators, experts, veterinarians, attorneys, and volunteers who uncovered appalling conditions in that facility where over 4,000 beagles were living. 445 beagles were found to be in acute distress when we arrived. After the examination by licensed veterinarians, that means that they needed immediate veterinary treatment to address a life-threatening illness, injury, or suffering. On May 19th, 2022, as the search warrant was still unfolding, a separate team, a civil team, moved for emergency relief here in the United States District Court for the Western District of Virginia and obtained a preliminary injunction resulting in the surrender of the remaining 4,000 beagles that were located at that Cumberland facility. And operations at that facility have since ceased. Until today, that was the last that had happened publicly in this case. But for the last 2 years, the team of individuals behind us, the individuals in this room as well, attorneys, special agents, investigators, experts from the United States Attorney's Office for the Western District of Virginia, from the Environmental Crime Section, from the Environment and Natural Resources Division of the Justice Department, from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Office of Inspector General, EPA's Criminal Investigations Division, in Virginia's Animal Law Unit and Animal Fighting Task Force. This team has been diligently investigating, wading through documents, interviewing witnesses, securing testimony, leading a grand jury investigation that has led to today's guilty pleas, which has some of these photos demonstrate just some of the milder examples of what was uncovered during that search warrant and our subsequent investigation, showing that Envigo conspired to knowingly violate the Animal Welfare Act as well as knowingly violating the Clean Water Act. So let's talk a little bit about what that investigation found. First, we found that Envigo failed to provide adequate veterinary care in compliance with the Animal Welfare Act, and leadership within the company knew about it and refused to terminate the attending veterinarian, even though they knew that care was inadequate. Just as an example, this attending veterinarian botched the surgery of several dogs, failing to have necessary supplies for these surgical procedures, misplaced medical records, mislabeled blood draw vials. This conduct was immediately and repeatedly provided to executive leadership, as well as a recommendation that the attending veterinarian be terminated, and it was refused. Specifically, the chief operating officer refused to fire the attending veterinarian, claiming that it was too hard to find a veterinarian at this facility. Again, prioritizing profits and convenience over following the law. In one of the most heart-wrenching examples that our investigation uncovered, it showed that Envigo employees failed to follow proper euthanasia procedures, resulting in the unnecessary pain and suffering of several dogs. Specifically, they withheld anesthesia from conscious dogs before performing a procedure called intracardiac injection euthanasia. In other words, they failed to sedate a dog before giving it a shot into its heart while performing a euthanasia. Moreover, at times, they failed to confirm and verify that a euthanized dog was actually deceased before disposing of it. They failed to ensure that healthy dogs were leaving the facility. Dead and sick animals were received by clients. Executive leadership team knew about these issues, yet continued to employ the veterinarian and allowed the dogs to be shipped, prioritizing profits and convenience over following the law. It was this care, or lack thereof, that resulted in 445 beagles being in acute distress when our team arrived during the search warrant in May of 2022. Second, Envigo failed to provide adequate housing to the animals. It was overcrowded. The Animal Welfare Act requires minimum floor spacing for dogs, nursing mothers, and puppies. Yet they were warned repeatedly that they were failing in that regard, and it still was overcrowded at the time that we arrived in May of 2022. This is no just matter of spacing. It actually can cause an aggressive disposition in the dogs, leading to fighting, injury, as you can see in one of these photos right here, and sometimes even death. The Animal Welfare Act also requires that the housing be designed to minimize injury. And Envigo was repeatedly warned and notified in these inspections that the kennel flooring was especially dangerous due to the gaps in the slatted floor that trap paws of dogs and puppies young as 6 to 7 weeks old. These dogs would require assistance to free their limbs, which would be caught in the flooring as depicted by this photo here on my left. Envigo knew that the flooring presented a constant risk, was cited at repeated inspections, and failed to correct it. And dogs knew this flooring were still on this non-compliant floor the day that they were seized and later when they were surrendered after our search warrant. Envigo also used a kennel system that allowed the dogs to have their body parts bitten or pulled through kennel walls by non-compatible dogs or because of their aggressive disposition caused by the overcrowding conditions that I mentioned before. Third, Envigo failed to provide basic necessities like clean water and food, all in violation of the Animal Welfare Act, and all to prioritize profits and convenience over following the law. Envigo knew that the water at the facility was not safe to drink. It provided its employees bottled water as well as water coolers, yet it still provided this non-potable water to the dogs. Automatic waterers there were discovered with black mold-like substance, rust-colored debris, and grime. And the same was with the food. At times, Envigo fed dogs that was contaminated with maggots, mold, or interspersed with live insects. The food receptacles, which are supposed to be impervious to water, were placed in a manner where they could be splashed with water and feces as they were being cleaned. It would be sprayed back into the feeders. These feeders were inadequately and infrequently sanitized, resulting in unpalatable food to the dogs. Again, Envigo was notified of this during routine inspections, and it was still ongoing at the time of our search warrant in May of 2022. Not only was the food unsanitary and contaminated, at other times, Envigo deprived dogs of sufficient food to maintain normal conditions and weight, as required by the Animal Welfare Act. Envigo withheld food from nursing mothers for a multiple-day period and maintained this practice for years. What was worse is they would actually turn the feeder around so that the nursing mother could smell and even see the food, but nevertheless could not access it. And then employees would falsely claim that the mothers had been fed, on days when they had not. Fourth, with respect to sanitation, Envigo is required under the Animal Welfare Act to clean these enclosures daily to remove excrement and food waste in order to reduce disease, hazards, insects, pests, and odors. And up until July of 2021, Envigo employees would clean kennels not once a day, but once every 2 weeks. They allowed feces to accumulate in the pens and troughs to the point that it would grow mold. And sometimes, when they were cleaned, Envigo employees would pump water contaminated with fecal matter into the kennels used to flush the troughs below the dogs' kennels. I mentioned earlier about the non-compliant flooring. Envigo eventually installed black mats on top to help address the issue. But these mats were not porous, and it would allow urine and feces to pool. And dogs, when we arrived in May of 2022, were found sleeping, lying, or standing in their own feces. And many of the dogs had injuries to their own paws caused by inflammation or injury from standing on dirty floors. The list simply goes on. There were chronic pest problems at the facility that were then treated as merely a characteristic of the facility rather than a violation of the Animal Welfare Act. They failed to keep records, and when they kept some, they were inadequate. At other times, they were falsified. They employed inadequate staffing. In July of 2021, they had only 39 employees at a facility where there were almost 5,000 dogs, resulting in a ratio of 128 dogs to 1 employee. And that assumes that all 39 of those employees were engaged in animal care, and they were not. This resulted in the deficient daily observation and contributed to those 445 beagles that were in acute distress when we arrived in May. The bottom line is that from at least July of 2021, members of Envigo's leadership team knew the facility was operating in violation of the Animal Welfare Act. The chief operating officer visited the facility firsthand and discussed these violations, but still they did not bring it into full compliance. In fact, 7 months after, in February of 2022, the Vice President of North American Operations described the conditions as even worse than they had seen 7 months before in July. Envigo employees estimated about $8 million to bring the facility into compliance with the Animal Welfare Act, but leadership delayed and declined such requests. The improvements that were made were insufficient, all in the name of promoting a business culture that prioritized profits and convenience over following the law. So today, we charged Envigo RMS, and they pled guilty to a conspiracy to knowingly violate the Animal Welfare Act here in the Western District of Virginia and elsewhere. The goal of this conspiracy was to unlawfully enrich themselves by avoiding millions of dollars in infrastructure upgrades and hiring requisite and competent trained human resources necessary to comply with the Animal Welfare Act. This investigation also uncovered a felony violation of the Clean Water Act, which Assistant Attorney General Kim will discuss in more detail in a moment, but the pattern is the same. Wastewater facility at the plant needed upgrades. Leadership team was placed on notice, and rather than spend the money to come into compliance, they chose to violate the Clean Water Act and pollute and contaminate our waterways here in Virginia. Now, I want to summarize the plea agreement that occurred here today in court, as well as this corporate resolution. Envigo pled guilty to a 2-count information. Count 1 charging a conspiracy to violate the Animal Welfare Act. Count 2, a conspiracy to violate the Clean Water Act. And Inotiv, its parent company, as well as Envigo, are bound to the terms of the resolution agreement and the plea agreement. Those agreements require that Inotiv and Envigo pay over $35 million in payments, plus the costs associated with the compliance monitor going forward. Those costs include, or the $35 million in payments include $22 million in fines, $11 million on each count, and that is the largest fine in any Animal Welfare Act case in history. They also have to pay $3 million in direct assistance payments to the Virginia Animal Fighting Task Force and the Humane Society. They have to pay $3.5 million to fund environmental projects designed to benefit ecosystems in Cumberland County, where this occurred. They also have to pay $7 million in improvements to existing facility and personnel. In addition to these historic monetary penalties, it also places Envigo and Envigo on 5 years of probation. Inotiv and Envigo are agreed to enhance standards for animal care to go above and beyond those minimum standards that are required by the Animal Welfare Act. Inotiv and Envigo agree to no longer breed or sell dogs. They will maintain and hire staff to ensure exceptional veterinary care. And to ensure this, they have to have a compliance monitor during the terms of probation to ensure compliance with the terms of the plea agreement, with the terms of the resolution agreement, and all other applicable laws allowing for on-site review at their facilities. Last and finally is the United States reserves the right explicitly in the agreement to pursue charges against any individuals that it deems necessary in this case. I'm going to have the opportunity to come back up here in just a moment, but now I'd like to invite Assistant Attorney General Kim for any remarks he'd like to make.
Thank you, U.S. Attorney Kavanaugh, for your remarks and for your office's continued work to prosecute this case. We would not be here today without the coordinated effort. And thank you all for being here. As the U.S. Attorney mentioned, my name is Todd Kim. I serve as the Assistant Attorney General in charge of the Justice Department's Environment and Natural Resources Division, including the hardworking and dedicated prosecutors in the Environmental Crimes section. We're here today to announce a plea agreement in which Envigo admits to criminally conspiring to violate the Animal Welfare Act and the Clean Water Act. Envigo violated federal law by subjecting thousands of beagles to conditions well below minimum standards at a breeding facility in Cumberland, Virginia. Dogs were abused. Dogs were subject to euthanasia without proper sedation. Food was withheld from nursing mothers. Dogs lived in overcrowded kennels, cleaned so infrequently that feces accumulated. Dogs were given non-potable drinking water, and at times, food contaminated with maggots and other insects. Envigo knew all this, and more, and yet Envigo failed to take sufficient action to bring this facility into compliance. Envigo's conduct led to the deaths of hundreds of dogs and harm to thousands of more. The cycle continued until law enforcement and the Justice Department stepped in. When law enforcement executed a multi-day search warrant at the facility in May 2022, we seized 445 beagles in acute distress. In court, we quickly sought an emergency temporary restraining order and a preliminary injunction. By September 2022, due to our actions, over 4,000 dogs had been transferred out of the Cumberland facility, pursuant to a consent agreement and with the help of the Humane Society of the United States. Today's announcement of a criminal plea agreement marks the next significant step in this matter. Why did this happen? Envigo placed profit before compliance with the law. Envigo unlawfully enriched itself by failing to spend the necessary money for upgrades and by failing to hire enough trained and competent staff, both of which it needed to do to comply with the Animal Welfare Act. Envigo hired and retained an unqualified attending veterinarian, despite known concerns. Envigo perpetuated deficient veterinary practices at the facility, sanctioning improper euthanasia procedures and inadequate health checks. It didn't have to be this way. Between 2019 and May 2022, Envigo received around $16 million in connection with the sale of nearly 15,000 dogs from this facility, yet all of those dogs were subjected to care that fell below the minimum standards required by law. Congress enacted the Animal Welfare Act in 1966 to ensure, among other things, that animals intended for use in research facilities receive humane care and treatment. The law sets forth standards of care so that animals have healthy environments in which to live and grow. As detailed in the criminal information filed today in the district court, Envigo repeatedly and egregiously fell short. The inadequate veterinary care and staffing at the Cumberland facility, combined with unsafe and unsanitary living conditions for the dogs housed there, led to beagles getting sick, suffering injuries, and repeatedly dying. After the search warrant, law enforcement continued its investigation, and as detailed in the criminal information, evidence was found of violations of the Clean Water Act as well. These related to an on-site wastewater treatment plant that Envigo used to treat dog and human waste. The company possessed a permit to discharge treated effluent into Maxey Mill Creek, but beginning no later than January of 2020, the treatment system was in trouble, and the facility needed capital improvements to properly handle the waste. Again though, Envigo failed to invest the funds necessary to bring the Cumberland facility into compliance with federal law, this time the terms of its Clean Water Act permit. By July 2021, Envigo substantially increased how much wastewater went to the treatment plant. This increase in wastewater taxed the old, worn-out system, resulting in violations of the permit and in water laden with fecal matter being used to flush the troughs below the dogs' kennels. Additionally, Envigo discharged more than 600,000 gallons of wastewater that failed to comply with permit limits into Maximo Creek. If accepted by the court, Envigo's plea agreement includes a commitment to pay two $11 million criminal fines, one for violating the Animal Welfare Act and another for violating the Clean Water Act. A total of $22 million in fines, including the largest ever fine in an Animal Welfare Act case. The plea agreement also includes provisions to hold Envigo and its affiliates, including Envigo's parent company, Inotiv, accountable and subject to increased animal care standards. All facilities that Envigo and Inotiv operate worldwide will exceed the minimum compliance requirements of the Animal Welfare Act. Envigo will no longer sell or breed dogs. It will improve its facilities and hire well-trained staff and veterinarians and hold continuing education requirements. All its facilities in the United States will adhere to a nationwide compliance plan. An independent compliance monitor will review all facilities and be empowered to take whatever steps are necessary to ensure Envigo is in full compliance with applicable laws, agreements, and terms of probation. In total, the plea agreement guarantees more than $35.5 million in commitments, including $22 million in fines, $7 million in facility improvements, and $3.5 million in mitigation, as well as the costs for funding the compliance monitor. The deterrence message here is clear. The Justice Department will vigorously prosecute violations of the Animal Welfare Act and the Clean Water Act. Our success today is attributable to the leadership and partnership of the prosecution team who stand with us here. I'll name a few. Bana Rangarajan, Sarah Brown, Randy Ramsauer, Carrie Macon, Corey Hall, Michelle Welch, Jillian Grubb, Stan Wajonski, Henry Barnett, and Allison Landsman. Prosecutors, staff, and law enforcement officers who gave tirelessly to this investigation, working long hours and weekends. I want to especially thank the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Office of Inspector General and the Environmental Protection Agency's Criminal Investigation Division for their work in investigating this case. I also want to thank the Virginia State Police for the security assistance provided during the multi-day federal search of the facility in May 2022, and the assistance of the Virginia Animal Fighting Task Force. And again, I want to recognize the work of U.S. Attorney Kavanaugh's team, as well as the Virginia Attorney General's Office, in partnering with our team at the Justice Department's Environment and Natural Resources Division in prosecuting this important case. And with that, I turn it back to U.S. Attorney Kavanaugh.
I want to reiterate and extend my gratitude again to the tireless public servants that were a part of this team, who spent days, nights, and weekends starting way before the search warrant and continuing all the way until today in this case. Because this resolution today is only regarding the company, the case remains ongoing, and for that reason, I will not be taking any questions today. If you have any factual questions, I'm going to point you to the 48-page criminal information that was filed today. Those are not simply just allegations that are included in that information. Those are stipulated and agreed to facts, which I think can address any remaining questions that you have. If you have any questions about the plea agreement, please reach out to our press spokesperson, Brian McGinn. I'd like to thank you all for coming here today.
One thought, if we could get the pictures taken down, we could get a shot of every crew behind you. Would that be useful?
That'd be okay.
I can't see a lot of the folks who are behind the